Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the channel. For over 1,000 years, kings and queens have ruled over the British Isles. But how did the monarchy begin? And how has it survived revolutions, scandals, and world wars? In this video, we're diving deep into the dramatic story of the British monarchy. You'll discover how it all began with ancient tribal leaders and early kings uniting the land. We'll trace the rise and fall of powerful dynasties like the Plantagenets, Tudors, and Stuarts, families that shaped not just Britain, but the course of world history. You'll learn about brutal power struggles, civil wars, and the slow transformation, from absolute rule to constitutional monarchy. We'll look at how monarchs like Henry VIII, Elizabeth I, and Queen Victoria left lasting legacies, and how others nearly lost it all. Finally, we'll explore how the British monarchy adapted to survive the modern era, from the trauma of 2 world wars to today's global media spotlight. Whether you're fascinated by royal history or curious about the institution's future, this video will give you the full picture of how the crown has endured through centuries of upheaval and change. To understand the British monarchy, we have to go back over 1,000 years to the Anglo-Saxon period. This was a time when England wasn't yet a unified kingdom, but a patchwork of smaller kingdoms like Wessex, Mercia, and Northumbria. One of the most important early rulers was Alfred the Great, King of Wessex in the late 9th century. He defended his kingdom against Viking invasions and laid the groundwork for a more unified England. Alfred wasn't just a warrior. He promoted education, legal reform, and a sense of English identity. Following in his footsteps, his grandson Ethelstan became the first king to effectively rule all of England. In the 10th century, Ethelstan consolidated control over the land, defeated rival kings, and began shaping what would become the English monarchy. His reign is often considered the beginning of the English nation-state, even though it was still in its infancy. But everything changed in 1066. That year, William, Duke of Normandy, crossed the English Channel and claimed the English throne, arguing that he had been promised it by King Edward the Confessor. William's forces defeated King Harold II at the Battle of Hastings, and William became known as William the Conqueror. His victory marked the end of Anglo-Saxon rule and the beginning of Norman control. The Norman conquest wasn't just a change of rulers, it transformed English society. William introduced a new aristocracy, replaced the Anglo-Saxon elite with Norman lords, and centralized royal authority. He ordered the creation of the Domesday Book, a massive survey of his new kingdom's land and resources, to better control taxation and governance. This was the true birth of the medieval monarchy in England, with new castles rising across the landscape and a stronger grip on the land. The monarchy began to evolve into a powerful, centralized institution. The seeds of modern royal authority were planted in this era, setting the stage for centuries of dynastic rule, conflict, and transformation. The Plantagenet dynasty marked one of the most dramatic and foundational periods in the history of the British monarchy. It began with Henry II, a powerful and ambitious ruler who controlled not only England, but vast territories in France. He married Eleanor of Aquitaine, one of the most influential and wealthy women of the medieval world. Their union created an empire stretching from Scotland to the Pyrenees, but it was also a source of constant internal conflict, including bitter feuds with their sons, most famously Richard the Lionheart and John. Before Henry II's reign, England was plunged into chaos during a period known as the Anarchy, a brutal civil war between Empress Matilda, Henry I's daughter, and her cousin Stephen of Blois. This battle for the crown left the kingdom fractured and lawless. When Henry II took the throne in 1154, he worked to restore royal authority, reform the legal system, and strengthen central control. But the Plantagenet legacy wasn't all about stability. One of the most infamous moments came during the reign of King John, Henry II's youngest son. His rule was marked by military failures, heavy taxation, and disputes with the church and nobility. In 1215, facing rebellion from his barons, John was forced to sign the Magna Carta, a document that, for the first time, limited the power of the monarch and asserted that even the king was subject to the law. Though its immediate impact was limited, the Magna Carta became a foundational symbol of constitutional governance. Later in the Plantagenet line, Edward III's reign, 1327 to 1377, became a turning point, not just for the monarchy, but for all of medieval England. When Edward came to power, the kingdom was still recovering from the political instability caused by his father, Edward II, whose weak rule and controversial favorites had undermined royal authority. Edward III quickly moved to restore the prestige of the crown, and one of his most defining decisions was to lay claim to the French throne. Edward's mother, Isabella of France, was the daughter of King Philip IV of France. When the French King Charles IV died without a male heir in 1328, Edward believed he had a legitimate right to the crown through Isabella. However, the French rejected this claim, invoking the Salic law, which barred succession through the female line. Instead, they gave the crown to Philip VI, a cousin of Charles IV. Edward initially accepted this, but tensions over control of French territories, particularly Gascony, reignited hostilities. In 1337, Edward formally claimed the French throne, launching what we now call the 100 Years' War. This wasn't just a dynastic dispute. It evolved into a vast and complex conflict with shifting alliances, economic implications, and a massive cultural impact. Edward III transformed the English military. He relied heavily on the longbow, a devastating weapon in trained hands, and shifted tactics from noble cavalry charges to disciplined, strategic infantry engagements. This innovation led to major victories, such as the Battle of Crécy in 1346 and the capture of Calais, securing a foothold on the continent. The war helped spark a new sense of English identity and pride. Edward styled himself as a warrior king, reviving the idea of chivalry and knighthood. He founded the Order of the Garter in 1348, an elite order of knights that still exists today as one of the highest honors in the UK. Literature and legend thrived in this atmosphere, drawing from Arthurian ideals and glorifying military valor. But the 100 Years' War was a double-edged sword. While it boosted national pride, it drained England's finances, burdened its people with taxes, and led to prolonged instability. It also contributed to a broader social transformation. During Edward's reign, the Black Death struck England in 1348-1350, killing roughly a third of the population. The combination of war, plague, and economic hardship began to erode the traditional feudal order. The legacy of the Plantagenet dynasty, particularly under Edward III, is a paradox. It represents both the height of medieval kingship and the beginnings of its unraveling. Edward III's reign was marked by a resurgence of royal authority, military expansion, and national pride. His successful campaigns in France gave him a heroic image, and he positioned the English crown as a dominant European force. His revival of chivalric ideals through institutions like the Order of the Garter helped cement a noble culture centered on loyalty to the king and the glory of battle. These achievements created a strong and admired monarchy, but they also created expectations and tensions that his successors struggled to fulfill. When Edward died in 1377, the throne passed to his 10-year-old grandson, Richard II. Richard was the son of Edward's eldest son, the Black Prince, who had died before he could inherit the crown. This early death disrupted the line of succession and weakened the stability of the monarchy. Richard II inherited a kingdom worn down by decades of war and the devastating effects of the Black Death, which had caused massive population loss, labor shortages, and social upheaval. Richard's rule exposed the cracks in the Plantagenet foundation. Initially governed by regents and powerful nobles, Richard eventually tried to assert his personal authority. But he lacked the political skill and military leadership that had defined his grandfather. His reliance on a small group of favorites, along with his autocratic tendencies, alienated the nobility. His attempts to suppress dissent, especially after the Peasants' Revolt of 1381, only deepened the divide. In 1399, Richard was deposed by his cousin Henry Bolingbroke, who took the crown as Henry IV. This moment was more than a political coup. It was a constitutional crisis. It shattered the idea of divine, unchallengeable kingship. From that point forward, the monarchy was vulnerable to the ambitions of rival nobles, many of whom were also Plantagenets. The deposition of Richard II set a dangerous precedent, that a king could be overthrown if he failed to meet the expectations of the powerful. What followed was a century of instability. The royal line split into two major branches, the House of Lancaster, descendants of John of Gaunt, Edward III's third son, and the House of York, descendants of Edmund of Langley, Edward's fourth son. Each had a claim to the throne, and each believed their claim was superior. This dynastic rivalry erupted into open warfare in the mid-15th century in a series of brutal civil wars known as the Wars of the Roses. The Wars of the Roses were a direct consequence of the Plantagenet legacy, a monarchy that had grown strong through conquest and law, but weakened by internal divisions, unchecked ambition, and the unclear rules of succession. These wars devastated the nobility, destabilized the country, and ultimately led to the downfall of the Plantagenet dynasty itself. In the end, the Plantagenets left behind a monarchy that was both powerful and vulnerable, shaped by the ideals of kingship but forever altered by the realities of ambition and conflict. Their influence is still felt today, in everything from the English legal tradition to the very structure of the modern British monarchy. But their story also serves as a cautionary tale. Even the most glorious reigns can sow the seeds of destruction if unity and succession are left unresolved. The Tudor dynasty, one of the most iconic in English history, began in the aftermath of the Bloody Wars of the Roses, a series of civil wars between the rival houses of Lancaster and York. When Henry Tudor defeated Richard III at the Battle of Bosworth Field in 1485, he became Henry VII, the first Tudor monarch. His rise wasn't just a military victory, it was a masterclass in political survival and power consolidation. Henry VII understood that to keep the fragile peace, he needed to unify the warring factions. He married Elizabeth of York, daughter of Edward IV, symbolically uniting Lancaster and York. He strengthened royal finances, avoided costly wars, and established the court of the Star Chamber to keep powerful nobles in check. Through careful alliances, strategic marriages, and a firm grip on law and order, he laid a stable foundation for the Tudor dynasty. Then came his son, Henry VIII, a king who would reshape England forever. Henry VIII began his reign in 1509 as a charismatic and athletic ruler, but he's best remembered for his dramatic break with the Catholic Church. Desperate for a male heir and frustrated by the Pope's refusal to annul his marriage to Catherine of Aragon, Henry took radical action. In 1534, he passed the Act of Supremacy, declaring himself the supreme head of the Church of England. This marked the beginning of the English Reformation. Henry went on to marry 6 times, executing 2 of his wives and fathering 3 children who would each take the throne. His dissolution of the monasteries not only shifted religious power, but transferred enormous wealth and land to the crown and loyal nobles. This fundamentally changed English society, diminished the influence of Rome, and sparked decades of religious tension. After the brief and turbulent reigns of his children Edward VI and Mary I, the crown passed to Elizabeth IV in 1558. Elizabeth inherited a divided country, torn by Protestant and Catholic conflict, and under threat from powerful rivals like Spain. But Elizabeth proved to be one of the most shrewd and resilient monarchs in English history. Known as the Virgin Queen, she never married, using her single status as a diplomatic tool. Under her rule, England experienced a cultural and political golden age. The Elizabethan era saw the flourishing of English drama, Shakespeare and Marlowe, and growing naval power, symbolized by the defeat of the Spanish Armada in 1588. Elizabeth maintained a careful balance between religious factions, encouraged exploration and trade, and strengthened England's identity as a Protestant power. Her long reign brought stability and pride, setting the stage for England's emergence as a global force. By the time Elizabeth died in 1603, the Tudor dynasty had transformed England, from a war-torn, divided realm into a centralized, culturally vibrant and politically powerful kingdom. But with no direct heir, the Tudor line ended with her. The crown passed to the Stuarts, opening a new and even more turbulent chapter in the monarchy's history. When Elizabeth I died in 1603 without an heir, the Tudor dynasty ended, but a new royal house began. The crown passed to her cousin James VI of Scotland, who became James I of England, uniting the crowns of England and Scotland under the Stuart dynasty. James III's reign was marked by tension from the start. Though he believed strongly in the Divine right of kings, ruling by God's will, he quickly clashed with Parliament, which was growing increasingly assertive. His lavish spending and authoritarian style made many uneasy. One of the most infamous moments of his reign came in 1605, the Gunpowder Plot, a failed Catholic conspiracy led by Guy Fawkes to blow up Parliament and assassinate the king. It left a deep scar in the national psyche and reinforced Protestant control. When James died in 1625, his son Charles I inherited the throne, and all the tensions that came with it. Charles believed even more firmly in divine right than his father, and often bypassed Parliament to raise money through controversial taxes. His marriage to a Catholic princess further alarmed his Protestant subjects. Over time, his refusal to compromise with Parliament led to open rebellion. In 1642, the English Civil War broke out. Royalists, or Cavaliers, loyal to the king against parliamentarians, or Roundheads, led by Oliver Cromwell. The war tore England apart and ended in a shocking and unprecedented event, the trial and execution of a reigning monarch. In 1649, Charles I was found guilty of high treason and beheaded, marking the temporary end of the monarchy. What followed was a bold experiment, a republic, officially called the Commonwealth of England, led by Oliver Cromwell. As Lord Protector, Cromwell ruled with strict Puritan values and suppressed dissent, especially in Ireland. Though he rejected the title of king, his rule was effectively a military dictatorship. After his death in 1658, the system quickly collapsed. By 1660, the monarchy was restored under Charles II, the son of the executed king. Known as the Restoration, his reign brought back a sense of normalcy and celebration, along with theater, music, and scientific discovery. But the conflicts between Crown and Parliament hadn't disappeared. After Charles II's death, his brother James II took the throne, but his open Catholicism and attempts to rule without Parliament reignited fears of absolutism. In 1688, Parliament invited James's Protestant daughter Mary and her husband William of Orange to take the throne. James fled without a fight, in what became known as the Glorious Revolution. In 1689, William and Mary accepted the Bill of Rights, which permanently limited royal power and affirmed the supremacy of Parliament. It was a foundational moment in the development of constitutional monarchy. For the first time, the monarch ruled not by divine right, but by the consent of the governed. The Stuart era was one of upheaval, civil war, regicide, republicanism, and revolution. But it was also the period that redefined the monarchy forever, turning it from an absolute institution into one bound by law, Parliament, and the will of the people. When Queen Anne, the last of the Stuarts, died in 1714 without a surviving heir, the British crown passed to the German House of Hanover thanks to the Act of Settlement. This act ensured a Protestant succession, bypassing many Catholic claimants. The first Hanoverian king, George III, spoke little English and had limited interest in British politics. As a result, power began to shift significantly, from the monarch to Parliament. This era saw the true rise of constitutional monarchy. With George I and his son George II often distant from the day-to-day governance of Britain, Parliament, and especially the office of the Prime Minister, grew in influence. Robert Walpole, considered Britain's first Prime Minister, emerged during this time, shaping a government led by ministers answerable to Parliament rather than the king. By the time George III ascended the throne in 1760, the monarchy had become more integrated with British politics, though the king still had considerable influence. George III tried to reassert royal authority, but his long reign would be defined by one of Britain's greatest losses, the American Revolution. Tensions had been rising for years between Britain and its colonies in North America, largely over taxation and governance. Colonists, angered by what they saw as a lack of representation in Parliament, eventually revolted. Despite George III's determination to keep the colonies, the British defeat in 1783 led to the independence of the United States, a humiliating blow to the empire and the king himself. This loss deeply affected George, and later in life, he would suffer bouts of mental illness that further reduced his role in government. Yet while Britain lost its American colonies, it began transforming at home. Under George III and his successors, George IV and William IV, Britain entered the Industrial Revolution, a seismic shift in economy and society. New machines, factories, and inventions powered by coal and steam revolutionized production, especially in textiles and manufacturing. Cities grew rapidly, and a new urban working class emerged. This was also a time of global expansion. While the empire contracted in North America, it expanded elsewhere, in India, the Caribbean, and parts of Africa. Trade, colonialism, and technological innovation turned Britain into a global superpower. Culturally, Georgian Britain was also dynamic. This was the age of Enlightenment thinkers like Isaac Newton and Adam Smith, of artistic achievements by painters like Hogarth and writers like Jane Austen. At the same time, deep social inequalities and harsh working conditions in factories sowed the seeds for future reform movements. The Hanoverian period firmly entrenched the constitutional monarchy, with the monarch playing a symbolic and stabilizing role rather than ruling outright. While kings and queens remained important, the true power had shifted to Parliament and the people's elected representatives. It was a pivotal chapter in shaping the modern British state, one defined not just by royalty, but by revolution, industry, and global ambition. The Victorian era, spanning from 1837 to 1901, marked one of the most transformative and iconic periods in British history. At its center was Queen Victoria, who ascended the throne at just 18 years old and would reign for over 6 decades, the second longest reign of any British monarch at the time. Her era witnessed Britain's evolution into the world's most powerful empire, and Victoria herself became the living symbol of that dominance. Under Victoria, the British Empire reached its peak, encompassing nearly a quarter of the world's population and vast territories across Africa, Asia, the Americas, and the Pacific. The motto, "The sun never sets on the British Empire," wasn't just a boast. It was a geopolitical reality. India was considered the crown jewel of this empire, and in 1876, Victoria was declared Empress of India, further solidifying her image as an imperial monarch. Domestically, the Victorian era was a time of incredible technological and cultural advancement. The Industrial Revolution, which had begun in the previous century, now matured into full force. Railroads spread across Britain, steamships connected global markets, and telegraphs enabled instant communication across continents. Great cities, like London and Manchester, expanded rapidly, becoming hubs of commerce, innovation, and culture. It was also the age of invention. Photography, electric lights, the telephone, and the first steps toward modern medicine transformed daily life. Meanwhile, writers like Charles Dickens, Charlotte Brontë, and Oscar Wilde helped define the literary richness of the age, exploring themes of poverty, morality, and the complexities of the rapidly changing society. But Victorian Britain was also a society of contrasts. While the upper and middle classes thrived in a world of decorum and respectability, the working class and the poor often lived in overcrowded, unsanitary conditions. Child labor, poor labor rights, and urban pollution plagued many areas, giving rise to social reform movements and new political activism. As for the monarchy, Victoria redefined its role in modern society. Unlike her Hanoverian predecessors, she embraced moral dignity and family values, becoming the model of respectability and domestic virtue. Her marriage to Prince Albert helped shape the ideal of the royal family as a symbol of national unity and moral leadership. After his death in 1861, she went into deep mourning, wearing black for the rest of her life. But her devotion only deepened public affection for her. By the late 19th century, Queen Victoria was not just a monarch, but a global icon. Her image appeared on coins, stamps, and portraits throughout the empire. She represented continuity, stability, and pride at a time when Britain was leading the world in industry, science, and military power. When she died in 1901, her funeral marked the end of an era. The Victorian age had turned Britain into a modern, industrial superpower and defined the monarchy not just as a seat of power, but as a symbol of empire, tradition, and national identity. The world she left behind was poised on the brink of the 20th century, a century that would challenge everything the Victorians had built. The 20th century brought dramatic change to the British monarchy, forcing it to adapt or risk irrelevance. In the year 1936, Edward VIII sparked a constitutional crisis when he chose love over duty, abdicating the throne to marry American divorcee Wallis Simpson. His brother became King George VI, leading Britain through the dark days of World War II. His steady, quiet leadership, alongside Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother, earned national respect. After his death in 1952, his daughter became queen, Elizabeth II, who would reign for 70 years. She modernized the monarchy, embracing TV, public engagements, and global diplomacy. But her reign wasn't without turmoil. Family scandals, including the divorces of her children and especially the tragic death of Princess Diana in 1997, shook the monarchy's image. Public anger at the royal family's perceived coldness forced change. The Queen ultimately adapted, making the monarchy more accessible and transparent in the media age. Despite challenges, Queen Elizabeth II preserved the monarchy's relevance through decades of social and political upheaval, setting the stage for a 21st century royal family. The 21st century ushered in a new chapter for the British monarchy, one defined by transition, scrutiny, and global change. In 2022, Queen Elizabeth II passed away at the age of 96, marking the end of a 70-year reign that had spanned from the post-war era to the digital age. Her death was met with worldwide mourning and reflection on a life of duty, dignity, and consistency. Her son became King Charles III, stepping into a role he'd prepared for his entire life. As monarch, Charles faces a different world, one where the royal family's role is constantly questioned. He is focused on streamlining the monarchy, promoting environmental issues, and maintaining unity within a more diverse Britain. But challenges remain. There are growing debates about the monarchy's relevance, especially among younger generations. The institution is under pressure to modernize further or risk alienating the public. Meanwhile, Republican movements have gained momentum in parts of the UK and abroad, and several nations in the Commonwealth are re-evaluating their ties to the crown, with some choosing to become republics. The British monarchy stands at a crossroads, balancing centuries of tradition with the need to stay relevant in a rapidly changing world. The legacy of the British monarchy extends far beyond politics. It's deeply woven into global culture, identity, and imagination. Culturally, the monarchy has inspired countless books, films, and TV shows, from The Crown to historical dramas and documentaries. This storytelling has helped humanize royalty, shaping public perception and sparking global fascination. The royals, especially figures like Princess Diana, Prince William, Kate Middleton, and Prince Harry, have become pop culture icons, constantly in the media spotlight. Economically, the monarchy is a tourism powerhouse. Millions visit royal palaces, watch ceremonies like Trooping the Colour, and travel to see sites associated with royal history. These traditions bring in significant revenue and help brand Britain globally. Politically, the monarchy now holds a purely symbolic role. While technically the sovereign remains the head of state, all real political power lies with Parliament. The monarch opens Parliament, signs laws, and performs diplomatic duties, but always under constitutional limits. Yet, the royal family's presence carries immense soft power, a unifying national symbol and a living link to history. Their influence is less about governing and more about representing continuity, tradition, and British identity on the world stage. Today, whether celebrated or criticized, the British monarchy remains a uniquely enduring institution, one whose legacy continues to evolve in real time. For over 1,000 years, the British monarchy has endured, rising from medieval battlefields, surviving civil wars, revolutions, world wars, and social upheaval. From Alfred the Great to King Charles III, it has transformed from absolute power to symbolic presence, constantly adapting to the shifting tides of history. We've seen dynasties rise and fall, the Plantagenets, Tudors, Stuarts, and Windsors, each leaving their mark. We've seen monarchs reshape religion, command empires, and eventually become figureheads in a modern democratic state. Throughout it all, the crown has remained a symbol of continuity and identity for Britain and the Commonwealth. But now, in the 21st century, the monarchy faces perhaps its greatest challenge: relevance. In a world driven by transparency, technology, and public accountability, will tradition be enough? Or will questions about its role, cost, and purpose finally outweigh its symbolic power? As the world changes faster than ever before, one question remains: can the monarchy continue to evolve, Or is it destined to become a relic of the past?